gonna get started. Hi, everyone. Good morning, evening, afternoon, from wherever you are tuning in. Welcome to CSTA's Professional Learning Series. Today we are featuring, or the topic for today is accommodating CS students with disabilities. Today's Wednesday, November 3rd. It's 6 o'clock in Central Time in the United States. Today we are featuring Ciras, and I'm very excited about what we're going to learn about today. We would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat, include your name, your location, and your favorite thing about fall. My name is Lily. I'm tuning in from Solvang, California, but I'm really from the Bay Area, Northern California. And like Robert Lee, I love how the colors of the leaves change. So we'd love to learn about what you like about the fall season. So we'll give that a second while people are continuing to join us. Okay, so thank you all for sharing. We see it coming in the chat. We'll continue to learn about each other that way. Today, I'm really excited about our guest presenter. Our presenter is Ciras. She's a high school special educator at Landmark School, which is in Beverly, Massachusetts. She's also a conference presenter for AccessCSForAll. And she's also a Equity Fellow alumni from CSTA from the second cohort, which is where I got to work with her on stuff. Well, actually, we're working on compiling articles for a book that the Equity Fellows are going to publish. And so that is a project that she is spearheading with two other colleagues. But Sarah is a wonderful CS educator. She has a lot to share, especially in the specific field that she's in special education. And we're really excited about what she has to share with us regarding how we can accommodate our computer science students who have disabilities. Because we all agree that if we are, the universal design of learning is that if we can accommodate all students who have some learning challenges, that we are accommodating all students. So we are excited. I'm going to pass it over to our presenter, Sarah.
Right, hello. So I am going to pop up my presentation for today. Okay. Transcriptioning, perfect. Okay. So my name is Ciras. One of my former students just joined the Zoom. Hello. So don't worry, she's going to make a little cameo in this slideshow anyway. All right, once this loads up. So my name is Ciras. I am a teacher at Landmark School in Beverly, as Lily just mentioned. I've been teaching there for 12 years now. Is everyone else seeing a loading screen instead of a presentation like I am? Yeah, no?
Still loading.
Yep, that's fine. Cool. All right, I'm gonna pause this for a second, see if I can figure out what went wrong here. Google just told me something went wrong. We figured that out. Thank you, Google. Guys, this is a really good example of how every time I try to present, something like this happens. Let's try again. Round two. Maybe. Or not.
It's gonna happen this time. I can feel it.
Always. This is the kind of thing my students live to see me fail with too. Oh, there we go. Can I see it?
Look out.
Hey,
Yes.
all right. Jason, I think you've gotten to see every time my presentation has not worked too.
I was just
So
thinking
that's
it was
why.
bad luck for you.
And the last time I presented, when I presented at CSTA at their regular conference, it worked fine. And I was like, hallelujah, but we're back in action. Okay. So anyway, my name is Ciras. I'm going to talk to you about accommodating language-based learning disabilities in the computer science classroom. Go. As Lily mentioned, I was an equity fellow last year, but my degree is actually in special education. And I am a research practitioner partner at AccessCSForAll. I've been working with them for about 6 years. I think I'm working with them right now on our 3rd National Science Foundation grant about making computer science accessible. We're right now moving into a focus on data science and also on K-8 education. So I'm excited to continue working with them. If you want to email me, feel free. I'll drop a link for the presentation at the end too, so you'll have access to all of these. I think it's really important to know that our students can do anything. I have had an incredible amount of students who are just so capable of anything they really put their minds to. It's really also key to know that 4.6% of students in the US are diagnosed with a specific learning disability. That means the odds are that a student in your classroom has a specific learning disability. So language-based learning disabilities is a huge umbrella of difference. Specific learning disability is the technical term under IDEA. And within that, there are several different pieces that you will see. So oral and written expression are the ways that you might see this presented. For oral expression, a student might have trouble getting their point across to you. They might have difficulty retrieving a word. You might see that when you ask a question, it might take a few minutes or a few seconds to respond. And to see difficulty with written expression, you might have a student who is struggling to complete writing assignments using correct grammar. Maybe they are struggling to put their thoughts into writing. I've had students in the past who could do an incredible job writing an essay with speech to text, but the minute you took that tool away from them, they really had a hard time getting their thoughts on paper. Decoding, fluency, and comprehension all make up reading as we know it. Decoding is the ability to break down words into syllables and make it into a recognizable unit. This becomes really important as reading becomes more complicated. Students need the time to break down the word as well as the strategies to know that this phonemic unit says XYZ. So as reading gets more complicated, it becomes more of an issue. Fluency is your ability to read with a high rate, with accuracy, and with expression. These 3 pieces all together are what makes someone a fluent reader. And otherwise, it can come across, the decoding issues they have will come across in their reading. Comprehension is your ability to understand what you're reading, and this can come across in oral discussion, oral listening comprehension, or in reading comprehension. In reading comprehension, I've had students in the past who could read something really well, and then at the end, when I questioned them about it, really had no idea what was going on. So much is going into what they are doing to decode. so much brain power is going into that they're not really giving as much thought to what's actually happening in the text. And so comprehension is lost. For listening comprehension, it's fairly similar in that you can be having a conversation with them. It seems like the student is following, but maybe when you ask them to reverbalize, they are unable to do so. So that's pretty important, being able to reverbalize. Auditory processing. I've had this explained to me by a student as I'm sitting here with you right now, and I can hear a squirrel in a tree. I can hear those two girls talking by the trash can. I can hear like a dog barking in the background. I can hear you talking to me, and I can hear like a phone vibrating. And my brain cannot pick out which of those is important. I don't know where to focus right now. Working memory is another piece you might see in students, and you might see this with anybody really. This is your ability to hold something in your short-term memory. So if someone's telling you a phone number and they list it off and all you get are the first 3 digits, right? 992-851-3651. And you're like, oh, I lost half of that, right? That's working memory. And that can be more of an issue for some than others. Dysgraphia is handwriting, ability to handwrite. Hopefully in computer science, it doesn't come up as much, but I mean, I think we've all heard of whiteboard interviews and how torturous that could seem. So that could come into play for our students. I also have students who still prefer to handwrite like plans and pseudocode and things like that. So it could come into play in that manner. Dysgraphia, I've had explained to me as it's like I'm painting the letter each time, right? Every time I do it, it's like I'm painting the letter G for the first time. Dyscalculia is a disability having to do with math and numbers. It often becomes an issue when they're visually similar numbers, like a 4 and a 9 can look really similar. You know, a plus sign and a multiplication sign, things like that, that can be really tough for kids to distinguish. And executive functioning. Executive functioning is the organization of time, materials, and information. The organization of time, things like scheduling, right? Making sure that you got the right time for what you're doing, breaking a project down. I put my executive functioning skills to the test today when I was like, okay, if this talk is at 6 p.m. Central Time and I'm in Eastern Time, what does that mean? And I had to go through and figure it out, right? And that's a skill to have to conquer. The organization of information could be note-taking skills, active reading skills, things like that. And the organization of materials, that can be anything from organizing your Google Drive to your desktop, to your backpack, to your purse. I think we all have the student who like opens their backpack and like things fly out, like socks and also a binder and 100 papers and like 3 snacks, right? So that is executive functioning. However, the important thing here is what can you do about that, right? We're all here to talk about ways we can accommodate students in our classroom, and universal design for learning is a system that benefits everyone. It's the idea that creating these accommodations makes learning more accessible for all, not just students who specifically have a learning disability. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about that. Oh, here we go. Okay, so some easy ways to accommodate. One way is to use multiple modalities, right? Allow students to use videos or books or audio. I really love having my students do hands-on stuff in the classroom. I mean, first of all, it's super fun. So there's that. But second of all, I let them choose what works for them, right? if a student learns really well from a YouTube tutorial, like thank God for YouTube, then go for it, right? That's a totally legitimate way to learn. Or if a student does really well with text, and I have had students who wanted textbooks and learned best that way, then awesome. I'm glad you figured out that that's what works for you. Or if audio is the best way, maybe podcasts or audiobooks, great, let's try it out, right? It's about what works best for that learner. Hardware, I like to use Arduinos in my classroom. I particularly like that because I think it's a great way for students to see what they have programmed, right? Like I program this and this light turns on. I program this and this motor is running. It's not where I usually start with my curriculum, but I like, for instance, we're starting Arduinos next week. So I just organized approximately 1 million small electrical components this week. But kids love it. And it's a great way to make learning really visible, make programming really visible, where sometimes it can be pretty abstract, right? Like I've done so much work and my output is, this program that doesn't necessarily show all the work I've put into it. And then another big one is to allow for movement, right? I have a lot of kinesthetic learners. I have a lot of kids who just love being up and about and moving around the room. And I have found that allowing them to have that freedom is really helpful. Okay. This is a photo of my actual classroom right now. This photo is from earlier this year. And you'll notice that we don't have, there's not a ton going on here, right? We actually have kind of like 3 separate spaces in this room. And we have some modular tables set up. We actually don't have chairs in my classroom, which teenagers are always very quick to complain about. But overall, they make do. We also have a lot of opportunity for hardware. So we have pretty much a full makerspace in our classroom. We have a Glowforge laser cutter. We have a 3D printer. We have a CNC machine, a pretty large CNC machine. I want to say it's 2 feet by 2 feet. And we have a Pocket NC 3-axis milling machine, which I think personally is a little bit extra, but it's cool. And that allows kids to get in there and really like build their own stuff, right? Like I have a student right now who's working on creating something with a Raspberry Pi and a camera and using OpenCV. And within that, he's also creating the mount for the camera that he created in Fusion 360 and will then 3D print so that the camera can be held solid in a mount. He also created a case for his Raspberry Pi. So that's all pretty fun stuff. Kids love to 3D print things for sure. But maybe the laser cutter is more fun. We've made some pretty cool time-lapse videos with that. And it's kinesthetic, right? Like kids are up and moving, kids are engaged. There are a fair amount of times per week where we're like, oh no, class is over. Everyone clean up, which definitely could fall into time management, executive functioning skills probably for me. But, they're up, they're moving, and they're engaged. Okay, so in my classroom, I try to keep a pretty, not a strict routine. We do deviate, but I try to keep a consistent routine. That sounds better. So we come in, we get settled in, and we usually have about 10 minutes of instruction time. I'll get up in front and teach some concept I want them to work on. Like for instance, this week, we're learning processing Java, and they are learning about objects for the first time. So we talked about classes and objects for about 10 minutes. Did I teach them everything about classes and objects in 10 minutes? No, I did not. But realistically, I'm not going to get up there and lecture for 50 minutes, right? I want them to take what I've shown them and now go try it out in their own work. So I do my 10 minutes of instruction, and then we break and we do essentially lab time for the rest of class, which we have 50-minute classes and we meet every day. My class is an all-year class. It's a graded elective that technically falls under the math department. So we have our 40 minutes of lab time, and students are able to work on their projects. They're able to help out each other. This is a great part of the day where I get to say, hey, you know, so-and-so is like doing a really great job working with XYZ. How about you go talk to them about that? Or, you know, I think you're on the right path here. I'm going to walk away and come back in a few minutes. How about you try this out first, right? Before I answer their question or try to solve their problem. We use Canvas as our learning management system, and I personally really like it. It has a lot of customizability, but I also try to make it so that all their resources are posted there, right? I don't want my class to be a time where they're like, oh, I don't know how to find XYZ, right? The time for them to figure that out is not right now. For a lot of them, it's their first computer science class. I want them to experience frustration at different points, but not around trying to find their resources. So everything's posted there so they can find it. So yeah, I float around, I help out, kids help each other. It's a really fun atmosphere, right? And what kid doesn't love to be the expert on something? It's a nice way to show students that their knowledge is appreciated and valued and that they can do this, right? It's not just about like, Ciras has all the knowledge in her head. Like, first off, none of them would believe that. They know I don't have all the knowledge in my head. They know there's very little knowledge in here, frankly. But they also get the message like they can do it, right? They can teach someone else this. We also do weekly and bi-weekly presentations, which are a really fun way to get kids talking about their work. So this is a nice way to build in vocabulary and to build in those oral expressive skills that they might not otherwise be getting. I think it's cognitive academic language proficiency, right? The ability to use academic language proficiently is tough. And it is a skill that needs to be worked on consistently. So every week I have my students get up in front of the class and talk about their work. It doesn't have to be formal. I do have kids who make PowerPoints sometimes, but usually they're like just a way to share memes, right? And they get up and they say, this is what I'm doing. This is what I want to do. These are the problems I'm having. And the other kids are able to ask questions. They're able to help, and they're able to see what their peers are doing, right? A lot of times in my class, the students have one overarching project they're working on, but everyone's going very different directions with it. Like, for instance, right now, the project they're working on in processing, I told students they could either build some interactive artwork or they could build a game. And I did that because I have some students who they've been with me for a couple of years. They have a little more experience with programming. And I have some students who are brand new. And I wanted them to find a path that felt comfortable for them. So they got to choose what they're doing. But as a result, it's not like, code Hangman and everyone's going to end up with Hangman. It's create some interactive artwork and we'll see what we come up with, right? Like, so far I've got a kid who has made like a game where when two colors collide, the ball disappears and you have to navigate through this like maze, right? I have another student who's made an interactive art piece that looks like an Argyle sweater met a rave. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it's quite a time. So it's a fun way to get them practicing in a low stakes environment. Okay, so Some ways to accommodate written expression and comprehension. Written expression, as we talked about, is a student's ability to get their thoughts into writing. In programming, this could be problematic, right? And some ways that I do it are providing cues to the students. I will also use structured worksheets. I will use word banks, right? Give them a page with some words on it, a literal page. I'll write words on the board, keywords on the board, so they can access that without having to rack their brain for it, right? I'm not right now trying to test their recall. I'm trying to allow them the tools they need to succeed in this classroom. Phonemic cues, where you give them the first sound of the word they're looking for. Guided questions. You know, I will ask essentially a leading question like a lawyer. I will try and guide them toward what I want them to figure out, or sentence stems. And I will show you an example on the next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a worksheet I've used in class. And it's pretty structured, but you'll see that I am providing sentence stems on the page. I have started off with what's the title of your project, and then give a 3 to 5 sentence overview of your project. So I'm pretty specific. My project is, my overall plan is, the end goal is. I tried to keep the page structured by including a table, right? Like, these are not big boxes. I'm not looking for, you know, like your life story. And I'm trying to keep it consistent. So I ask what tasks, what had to be done. And then I give them the stem of the sentence, right? First I, and then they have to fill it in. To put it together, I did this by. In the past, I've also had students submit to me spreadsheets that included materials as well as cost, where to buy them. And that's for when we get into hardware. But it's also some real world experience of like, I'm planning out this project. These are the things I'm going to need. And this is how I procure them. Okay, accommodating oral expression. One of the top ways that I do this is really through class discussion. But the top hit is to rehearse, right? Rehearse. Oral rehearsal is really key. I've had so many students who are having a hard time getting their thoughts together. For instance, I've had a student who was having trouble working with another student in class. And I pulled one aside and said, like, I think you're having a hard time getting your point across here. Like, let's essentially role play it, right? We pretty much practiced the conversation. They were partners on a project, and by role playing through that, he had some ammunition going into the conversation that he could pull because he'd already had this conversation with me. Class discussion, right? A lot of times my classes typically are like 6 to 8 students. I have 8 students in one class and 7 students in another right now. We max out at 8 because it is a fully special ed setting. And as a result, we have like whole class discussions all the time. And it's so great, particularly because the students come from so many different places, which is very fun. You can also use think alouds. So I will often talk my way through a problem with a student. And I see students do this all the time too. The number of times, and this is probably not a unique to me experience, the number of times a student calls me over and they're so frustrated and they're like, oh my God, Miss Ciras, I don't know what the problem is. And I just wait and they explain and I just kind of nod. And by the end of it, they're like, oh, I know exactly what I have to do. And I'm like, all right, cool, great talk. This is the kind of teaching I love. I'm gonna go back over here. But you know, like, it's nice for them to know I didn't actually need help. I just needed to talk it through, right? It's not that they don't understand the logic of what they're working on or something like that. It's that they just needed to talk it over. Modeling planning. where I will talk through a project or a process with students, and partner programming. So this is good if you are going to have kids working on a project together, because it teaches those interpersonal skills. Right? Nobody is programming in a vacuum. Like, it's not happening in the real world, right? Software is a very collaborative environment, and it's important for them to have the skills to talk to other people. Okay. So here is an example of a long-term planning checklist. This is something I use when I am working on, usually in the second half of the year, we're doing a long-term project. Right now, the projects we've done have been limited to about 3 weeks or so. But as we get into hardware, students will have opportunities to work on projects of their own design. And that could be hardware, or it could just be software. And we'll utilize something like this when we do it. I like this because it's an explicit teaching of executive functioning skills, right? Like, I have things on here like create a calendar with important dates on it. And I'll hand out physical calendars to kids that I printed out. They have the option to do it on a computer, but I find a lot of times having it physically in front of them to start is really helpful. There are other pieces on here that are like, plot out due dates on your calendar and set reminders, right? And think about what you have going on in your life, right? The third point, create a calendar with important dates on it. Prom, birthdays, things like that, right? And that can be really helpful because it's not necessarily something they think about, right? A lot of times students haven't had to plan their own time, right? Like, their parents do it for them, their teachers do it for them. So this is a skill that I think almost any student could benefit from having explicit discussion of. The first time I do this with them, I go through the whole process. We start at the very beginning. We say, okay, what's your project? What are you going to have to do to complete this project? How long do you think it's going to take you to do that? What happens if you miss a deadline? Everything gets pushed back, right? And I have found that it's really important to model grace with them, right? I have students right now who are working on their interactive art and their games. And I had a student who was like, this game is not going to be that fun. I was like, that's okay, right? I'm not looking for some incredible, perfect project, right? I'm looking to see that you can implement these things on your own and that you can then go forward and take those into a better project next time, right? Or I had a student who recently asked, recently was like, I'm going to maybe need an extension on this project. I don't think it's going to have XYZ that I wanted to have. And I was like, I think it's going to be all right, right? Like, you're hitting the requirements for the project. But we're battling with that like perfectionism, right? So, show them what it looks like to have grace for yourself and for them. Okay. So executive functioning accommodation, we just talked a little bit about how we organize time with that checklist. So we talk about calendars, when, you're going to have a half day this day, so we won't meet that day. Are you going to be able to still get this done? Providing a checklist or a syllabus. I've had students work off a syllabus and love it. They have found that to be very helpful in the past. And I've had other students who absolutely hate it. So it's a mixed bag, but it can be really useful for some students. The organization of information. I use templates a lot. Kids get a lot of templates. I also try to circle back, right? So we talked about objects and classes today, but we also talked about arrays again, right? And how you can use arrays with objects. And we talked about iteration again, right? And I tried to throw the word iteration back in there, increment, decrement. So I try to hit these words over and over again so that kids will be more familiar with them as we go forward. It's also important, I think, to have the student verbalize back to you. Like in an instance with my own teenager, we had a conversation where her principal was talking to her about something. And at the end, the principal was like, okay, do you understand? And my daughter was like, yeah, yep. And I was like, okay, so can you repeat that back to me? And she was like, oh, no, I have no idea what he was saying. I was like, okay, cool, let's try that again. And that is, again, also not a unique story. The organization of materials. I think it's really helpful to provide students with an organizational system, right? Like, this is what I expect you to have, or like, this is the naming convention for your files, or to provide them with digital materials, right? Instead of a physical worksheet, could this be a Google Doc that you share? And to have resources up on a learning management system like Google Classroom or Canvas or something like that. And it's also important to provide time for that, right? Students need the time to actually put stuff away. I'm definitely guilty of this, but there are definitely, as I said before, right? Oh, class is over. Oh no, right? Let's clean up. But to note, we have 3 minutes left. Take out your notebooks, write down your homework or your assignment or your tasks, check your calendar, right? Making sure you build that time into your class period for students can be really helpful, because they just otherwise don't get it, right? Kids shove all their stuff in their backpack and they run out the door. Ways to accommodate for auditory processing. One of the key points is to allow time. I think that some of the most important point is to just provide wait time, right? And to speak more slowly. Those pieces are really important. And also to write and then share. So I try to have like key points in my classroom up on the board at all times. You could also speak less, right? As much as we all love to hear ourselves talk, right? Like, who didn't get into teaching to like talk all day? I don't know, maybe there are people who didn't, but I can't relate to that. So speaking less can be helpful, right? Like a 50-minute lecture, how much of that's going to get absorbed? Whereas, if you have everyone's attention for a good 5 minutes, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all you really need. And then scaffolding notes can be really helpful. So if you are going to have a lengthy lecture, provide students with some pre-written notes that they can fill in as they go, so that they're not having to take notes while listening, which can be really tough. And to use a digital LMS like Classroom or Canvas. That way students can access in their own time. Okay, so this is an example of my whiteboard. I took this picture a few weeks ago. I took it because I wanted to get those project requirements, but later I was looking at it and was like, oh, this is actually like a pretty good example of what I'm doing all class every day. So you'll see that I have included keywords spelled out. I haven't even touched upon this yet, but spelling is probably like my students' number one enemy of all time. The number of times I've had a kid come over and be like, this is not working, and they like spelled void wrong, right? Like VIOD instead of VOID. So I make sure that I have examples of common keywords up on the board so that they can check their work. I also have the project requirements written out explicitly, right? Like for this project, this was their first project in processing. They had to include 3 different shapes, 4 different colors, 2 user created variables. They had to use a string. They had to have interactivity. And I was like very explicit about this, included in a rubric, right? This is what you get if you do these pieces. I also include full syntax for easy reference. This is another piece that can be really tough. I've liked using Java with them so far because it is more explicit, right? Like we end our line with a semicolon, like a pretty hard and fast rule. But I have also found though that it can be more difficult with something like Python, right? Where a student is trying to figure it out by white space. And I find that to be pretty abstract. I think I have yet to meet a student for whom Python was their favorite language. which is a real bummer because I think it's a pretty common starter language for college. So you see my beautiful whiteboard example. It is a mess, but I do at least have a lot of good colors up there. Okay, so some tools for accessibility. These are, Python. Okay, so tools for accessibility. I have my students use WebStorm IDEs as much as possible. This was actually really tough last year because I had a mix of remote students and in-person students, and I had several kids who used Chromebooks and couldn't download IDEs, which was tough, but we did use Replit and we were pretty successful with that. But WebStorm has built-in tools for accessibility like no other IDE I've seen so far. So they will do things like native spell checker, which a fair amount of IDEs have that now, but still not all. But they also will spell check user created variables, which I adore. The number of times I've had a student spell the word answer wrong, right? And then that they've created a variable for a user input called answer, and they spell it wrong one way, and then they spell it wrong a different way. And WebStorm will jump in and say, hey, did you mean this variable? So helpful, because I don't want my students getting frustrated with aspects of their disability, right? I want those barriers as invisible as possible. I want them to be able to focus on the logic and on the code and on their project and their end goal. So WebStorm has a lot of really great accessibility features in that way. And also free educational licensing. Yeah, never paid for WebStorm. It's great. So definitely check that out. YouTube. I don't know what we did before YouTube. I guess we just read books. I do like reading books, but also I like to watch coding videos. So this links to the Coding Train by Daniel Schiffman. If you've seen any of his videos, he is like the most genuinely excited human about programming. And my students unironically love him. He covers JavaScript and Java, and I think Python maybe now. I'm not 100% certain on that, but his videos are really great. He walks you through like all of processing, and they're super fun. But there are a bunch of different YouTubers that allow all these different accessible tutorials, right? So definitely use YouTube, right? Encourage your students to seek stuff out. Quorum is a programming language that was created by Andreas Stefik out of the University of Nevada. He and his team put it together, and it is screen reader accessible. It was built with accessibility in mind, and that was the whole point of it. And it is awesome. It's really fun. Within this language, you're able to create like a dungeon crawler, like within a few days of lessons, right? It's really enjoyable. So definitely check that out. I also personally really like starting kids off with a block-based language. I very rarely have a student complain about that, even at the high school level, because it's just fun, right? Like getting in there and trying out Scratch, trying out App Inventor. That's what we did this year, as well as Blockly is another one. And I'm sure there are a bunch more. Though something to be aware of with block-based languages are that they are not very accessible for people who are blind or visually impaired. So keep that in mind. That can be tough. I love starting them there because they get to learn the logic without the problems of spelling, right? Spelling can be kind of a bummer. Next up, the Head First series by O'Reilly. Okay, I just bought myself Head First C# to read because my students really want to do Unity, and just looking at it makes my head spin. But I can't speak highly enough about the Head First series. They are interactive textbooks. I use a lot of their diagrams and images with my students because I think they do a really great job of explaining different coding concepts. So I definitely recommend checking them out. You can get PDFs of them, or you could get the actual physical book. So check those out. They have them for most programming languages. I did look up their Java one. The most recent Java one was published in 2005, but they have a new one coming out in 2021. So if you teach AP CSA or B, that could be something to check out. Arduino, as I already said, I love Arduino. It is just super fun, and there are a bunch of different things you can do with it, right? And I think kids love to have a physical product that they can walk away with. So I definitely recommend, if you can afford them, they're usually like $23 for an Uno, and you could do so much with it. And project-based learning. I think my whole year is project-based learning. I very rarely am like, let me teach you this for the sake of teaching it to you. It's more, like you want to learn how to make a game. That means you need to learn collision, right? You want to learn how to make an RC car. It means you need to learn about motors, right? You need to learn how to control it. So those are important skills that being able to take a project apart and figure out what you need to learn to do that project, I think is probably one of the best ways to learn, right? Letting students kind of dig in and figure out what they need to try it out. Okay. All right, getting close to wrapping up. I want to leave some time for questions because I have seen this chat has been super active and I'm really excited to read through it. So self-advocacy. I think this is maybe one of the most important pieces that you as an educator can impart to your student. You want to teach them to be their own champion. They are the expert in their own disability, right? As someone who is able-bodied and does not have any disabilities, I cannot entirely relate to what my students are going through, right? It's their own experience and they are the expert on what they need to succeed. My job as an educator is to be able to sit down with them and help them figure out what they need, right? What kinds of note-taking strategies work for you, right? What kind of mode of learning works best for you? So those are the pieces that I want them to be able to take away. This next piece. This is a worksheet I made for a student who was having a hard time advocating for themselves in the classroom. So I scaffolded for them what they could do. I called it, hold up, I have a question. We put it in the front of their binder. And it allowed the student to, when he was having trouble in class, he didn't understand something, or he was having trouble remembering, it gave him questions that he could ask to advocate for himself. And, I'm sure I miss things in my classroom, right? I have a student right now who, whenever he is having trouble, he doesn't ask for help. He just kind of looks over at me and waits. And, the goal will be for him to be able to ask me for help, right? To say, I need XYZ from you, and we'll get there. But until then, right, something like this could go a long way. I'm having trouble understanding or picturing. Can I see an example? Can you show me this? Can you work through an example with me? I think it's also really important to hold room for kids who may need more time, right? Allow time to wait, or be able to go over this again with a student, reteach, pre-teach, right? So you can make a handout like this for a bunch of different things. It really depends on what the student needs, but this is what that student in particular needed. Okay, I feel like this is pretty good timing overall. So if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them.